over 60 years, Cliff Richard has been the golden boy of British pop, selling hundreds of millions of records, knighted by the Queen, and praised for his clean-cut image. But behind that polished smile lies a story almost no one talks about. Away from the cameras, Cliff clashed with some of the most powerful names in film and theater, fights that were personal, bitter, and sometimes downright humiliating. These weren't playful rivalries. They were wars of pride that left lasting scars. And one feud in particular was so explosive, Cliff still refuses to speak about it even now. So, what happens when the world's most polite pop star finally loses his patience? Stay tuned. You're about to find out. David Hemmings
does have a tick, which is that. And if you're an actor, giving your all, and I was actually giving in my craft or sullen art, which is like the worst conceivable idea for the kind of character that I was.
The 1960s were a strange time for British entertainment. On one side, you had Cliff Richard, the nation's wholesome pop prince, pressed suits, neat hair, and songs your grandmother could approve of. On the other side were actors like David Hemmings, who embodied everything messy, rebellious, and unapologetically new about the era. If Cliff was the clean shine of the old guard, Hemmings was the scruffy voice of the counterculture, full of mischief and unfiltered opinions. The first real clash between these two men happened in 1967 during a televised ITV chat show. At the time, Hemmings was riding high off the success of Blow Up, Michelangelo Antonioni's art house masterpiece that critics adored but ordinary audiences often found baffling or downright grim. The film was stylish, daring, and loaded with the kind of existential darkness Cliff wanted nothing to do with. So when the host turned to Cliff for his opinion on Hemmings' latest work, he tried to tread carefully. With his trademark diplomacy, he gave a polite but distant answer. "It's a bit too grim for my taste. Nothing sharp, nothing personal, just a smooth dodge." But David Hemmings was not the type to let things slide. He leaned into his microphone, flashing that cheeky grin, and delivered a line that instantly cut through the polite chatter. He called Cliff Richard a walking Christmas card. The audience exploded with laughter. Even the host couldn't suppress a chuckle. And in that single moment, Hemmings had turned Cliff's carefully cultivated image, squeaky clean, cheery, picture perfect, into a punchline. Cliff tried to smile through it, but cameras have a way of catching the truth. His grin stiffened, his eyes went cold, and for the first time, viewers could see a crack in the polished exterior. The remark may have been 4 words long, but it hit Cliff like a hammer. Now, in most showbiz rivalries, moments like this fade with time. But in this case, the tension only deepened. Fast forward 11 years to 1978, when both men were booked for the legendary Morecambe and Wise Christmas special. This wasn't just another gig. At its peak, this show drew audiences of more than 20 million viewers, the kind of exposure every performer craved. Behind the scenes, though, it was anything but festive. Crew members later recalled how Cliff and Hemmings practically pretended the other didn't exist. They avoided eye contact, communicated only through third parties, and kept rehearsals as brief and frosty as possible. And the grudge spilled onto the screen. During the live broadcast, when the cast lined up to take their bows, Hemmings received warm applause from the studio audience. Cliff, seated nearby, made no move to clap. His hands stayed locked in his lap, his face calm but unyielding. It was a quiet protest, but to anyone paying attention, it spoke volumes. Years passed, but the bitterness never seemed to melt. During a live phone-in on BBC Radio 1, a caller casually asked Cliff about his experience working with Hemmings. Cliff paused. Then, in that smooth, polite tone he was famous for, he delivered a line sharp enough to slice glass. "I prefer to work with gentlemen." That was Cliff's way. He would never shout, never swear, never throw a public tantrum. But once he marked someone as falling short of his standards, the wound never healed. Hemmings's offhand quip back in 1967 had crossed a line in Cliff's book, and decades later, he still wasn't letting it go. And here's where the story takes an even more interesting turn. Because while David Hemmings loved to poke fun, Cliff's next rival was a man known for his volcanic temper, wild drinking, and public brawls. Oliver Reed.
A plain suit.
I haven't got a bowler hat.
And they'd sit there and they'd say, "Can I have a look?" Where's my bowler hat?
What do you want?
I came on with a bowler hat.
Oh, you did? Did you? Oh.
Oliver Reed was the exact opposite. Loud, wild, and about as subtle as a bar fight. And that's exactly why he and Cliff Richard were never going to get along. They were complete opposites. Cliff built his whole career on being squeaky clean, disciplined, and safe enough to bring home to your mum. Oliver Reed, on the other hand, he was chaos in human form. The trouble started in the mid-70s. Cliff had this dream project, a remake of Heathcliff. He wasn't just lending his name to it, he was all in. He was working on the score, planning a cameo, and trying to shape it into the kind of sweeping romantic film he always wanted to be a part of. But then, the producers floated the idea of casting Oliver Reed in the lead. Now, on paper, it actually made sense. Reed was intense. He had this brooding, dangerous energy on screen. He'd already shown it in Oliver, back in 1968, and Women in Love, the year after that. People couldn't take their eyes off him. But Cliff didn't see talent, he saw trouble. Reed was already notorious for drinking binges, bar brawls, and those infamous TV interviews where you never knew if he was going to charm the audience or completely embarrass himself. Cliff thought putting Reed in Heathcliff would sink the whole project, and instead of keeping his opinion private, Cliff went straight to the film's backers and told them flat out, Reed was box office poison. He said you couldn't sell a heartfelt romantic story with someone who was making headlines for falling over drunk or fighting strangers. For Cliff, it wasn't just a bad casting choice, it was a moral one. Of course, this news got back to Oliver Reed. And where was he when he heard it? Exactly where you'd expect. In the Tramp nightclub in London, pint in hand, surrounded by hangers-on. Someone told him what Cliff had said, and Reed exploded. His response was short, sharp, and designed to cut deep. "Stick to singing, choir boy." That was Reed all over, mocking Cliff's clean-cut image and dismissing him in one line. It could have ended there. But fate decided to stir the pot a little more. Not long after, the two men ended up at the same industry event. Eyewitnesses say Reed spotted Cliff across the room and went for him. Now, Cliff was not the kind of man used to being confronted, especially not by a towering, half-drunk movie star. People who were there said Cliff's face turned pale, like all the color drained out at once. And when Reed got up in his face, Cliff fired back with something quick and cold. "I don't drink with animals." Then he walked out before it could get any uglier. That one line gave Reed endless material. For years he'd retell the story, always adding a flourish, claiming Cliff ran like a frightened gazelle. He clearly loved the idea of rattling him. Cliff, though, never saw it as funny. To him, Reed represented everything he couldn't stand: excess, chaos, and that whole live fast die young mentality. When Reed died in 1999, tributes poured in from actors and fans who adored him. Cliff? He didn't say a word. He didn't attend any memorials. Later, he admitted to a friend, "Some people live for chaos. I live for harmony." That summed it up perfectly. Their feud wasn't really about a film role. It was about two men who couldn't have been more different. And while Reed was all noise and fire, the next clash in Cliff's life came from someone you'd never expect. Michael York.
I'm an Aries. I'm sort of mad. I sort of jump straight in, often unthinking. But I'd much rather rue the sins of commission than those of omission. I'd much rather...
When people talk about the golden years of British film and music, two names often come up in very different conversations: Cliff Richard and Michael York. On the surface, they couldn't have been more different. Cliff was the polished pop idol, Britain's answer to Elvis, with a wholesome reputation that had parents approving and teenagers swooning. York, on the other hand, was the Oxford-educated actor with a sharp wit, a polished accent, and a career that was beginning to soar thanks to roles in films like Cabaret and The Three Musketeers. But in the early 1970s, their worlds collided, and the fallout created one of the coldest grudges in show business. It all centered around the 1972 film version of Godspell. The stage show had already been a huge hit in London, a modern retelling of biblical parables with street clothes, folk rock music, and a counterculture edge that resonated with the times. Cliff Richard, eager to prove that he was more than just a squeaky clean singer, set his sights on the role of Jesus. He was passionate about it. He even spoke in interviews about feeling a personal connection to the part, saying he believed he could bring both authenticity and sincerity to the role. But there was a problem. Michael York was already attached to the project as John the Baptist, and according to multiple accounts, he wasn't thrilled with the idea of sharing the screen with Cliff. York reportedly pulled the director aside and argued that casting a household name like Cliff would ruin the film's gritty, grassroots feel. To him, Godspell needed fresh, unknown faces, not a teen idol whose image was built on glossy pop records and family-friendly variety shows. Whether York was simply voicing an artistic opinion or actively working against Cliff is still debated. But what isn't debated is the result. Cliff was dropped from consideration, and the part of Jesus went to a relatively unknown American actor, Victor Garber. For Cliff, the rejection wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. He believed Michael York had sabotaged him, and that betrayal stayed with him for decades. The two men began what could only be described as a silent Cold War. They moved in the same entertainment circles, attended the same industry events, but they never spoke. One night in the late 1970s, at a glittering BAFTA after-party, York decided to break the ice. Spotting Cliff across the room, he walked over, extended his hand, and tried to make peace. Cliff, however, was not in the mood for forgiveness. He looked York directly in the eye and delivered a line so sharp it cut through the noise of the party. "Time doesn't heal everything, Michael." With that, Cliff turned on his heel and walked away, leaving York frozen in place. The tension never softened. Even in 1992, when they were both booked to appear at the Royal Variety performance, the photographs from that night spoke volumes. In wide group shots, they positioned themselves as far apart as possible. In the few moments they were closer, the stiffness in their posture and the absence of warmth in their faces told the real story. For Cliff Richard, the battle over Godspell wasn't just about losing a role, it was about losing respect. And in his eyes, Michael York had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Peter O'Toole. Peter O'Toole was one of those actors who carried chaos with him like a second coat. Brilliant on screen, magnetic on stage, and utterly unpredictable in real life, he was equal parts genius and troublemaker. And in the mid-70s, his playful cruelty crossed paths with Cliff Richard in a way that left scars lasting decades. The setting was Pinewood Studios in 1975. Cliff had been invited for a cameo in a light-hearted film called The 33rd Summer. On the neighboring soundstage, O'Toole was shooting scenes for a different project. Both men happened to wander into the same studio canteen for lunch, a casual setting that quickly turned into something Cliff would never forget. At first, the encounter seemed harmless. They sat at the same long table, surrounded by extras, technicians, and assistants. Cliff, polite as ever, kept the conversation steady. But O'Toole, famous for his razor-sharp tongue and larger-than-life presence, couldn't resist turning the moment into theater. With his booming aristocratic voice, he began poking fun at Cliff's squeaky clean image. He gestured dramatically with his wine glass and quipped that even the Queen's corgis howl along to Cliff's hymns on Sunday mornings. The canteen roared with laughter. For the onlookers, it was a masterclass in O'Toole's wit. But for Cliff, who had spent years defending his seriousness as an artist, it was salt in an old wound. He sat frozen, face tight, fork untouched. He wasn't laughing. To him, this wasn't harmless banter. It was a very public humiliation. Cliff didn't let it go. Later that afternoon, he marched to O'Toole's dressing room, determined to confront the legendary actor directly. There was no audience now, just Cliff's simmering anger, and O'Toole reclining in his chair, cigarette in hand. Cliff demanded an apology, saying the joke had been insulting, cruel, and unnecessary. O'Toole, true to form, dismissed the plea. He smirked, tilted his head, and delivered a line that would end their relationship before it even began. "Lighten up, Sir Choir Boy." That cutting nickname stuck, and Cliff stormed out. From that moment, the feud was sealed. Years later, the bitterness still lingered. In 1980, Cliff was approached for a cameo in a film that could have boosted his acting credibility. He was ready to say yes, until he discovered Peter O'Toole was also in the cast. Cliff pulled out immediately. He didn't care about the career opportunity. To him, working alongside O'Toole again was unthinkable. Even today, friends say Cliff shuts down the conversation the moment O'Toole's name comes up. No jokes, no nostalgia, just a hard wall of silence. And as personal as this grudge was, it set the stage for an even deeper wound. Because if O'Toole managed to humiliate Cliff with words, another actor would cut him far deeper. Richard Burton.
It's been one of the things that's quite difficult in acting, is that I don't like to be touched by other actors or actresses or whatever, unless it's...
If there's one name that could still make Cliff Richard bristle, even decades later, it's Richard Burton. Burton wasn't just an actor, he was a force of nature. He had that rich, booming voice that could make Shakespeare sound like music, and he carried himself like he owned every room he walked into. He was brilliant, but he was also known for his volcanic temper and a drinking habit that sometimes burned bridges faster than his talent could build them. And when Burton and Cliff's paths crossed, it was never going to be pretty. The trouble really began back in the late 1970s. Cliff had been quietly working towards something people didn't always expect from him: serious theater. He wasn't content to just be the bachelor boy forever. He wanted a role that would let him prove himself on stage. In 1977, he got his chance. Producers were planning a West End revival of Camelot, and Cliff was in advanced talks to play King Arthur. It wasn't just talk either. Julie Andrews was set to play Guinevere. Imagine the headlines: Cliff Richard and Julie Andrews on stage, together in one of the most beloved musicals of all time. Cliff thought he had it in the bag, but Richard Burton thought otherwise. Burton had originated the role of King Arthur on Broadway back in the early 60s and starred in the film version in 1967. To him, Arthur wasn't just a part, it was his part. And the idea of a pop star, no matter how beloved, stepping into those boots felt like sacrilege. Burton reportedly stormed into the producer's office and with that trademark blend of arrogance and charm gave them a blunt choice. If the pop singer steps on my stage, I walk. It was a threat no producer could afford to ignore. Burton's name still drew crowds, and Cliff, despite his fame, couldn't match that kind of theatrical gravitas. So Cliff was quietly pushed aside. Officially, his team said scheduling conflicts had forced him out, but behind the scenes, he was devastated. Friends later said he brooded for months. This wasn't just losing a role, it was losing a chance to be taken seriously in a new arena, crushed under the weight of Burton's ego. That tension lingered for years until fate brought them together again in 1983. Both men were booked as guests on Parkinson, the BBC's flagship talk show, where sparks often flew behind the scenes. Backstage, the atmosphere was electric. Burton with his whiskey in hand, Cliff with his carefully polite smile. It didn't take long for the dam to break. Burton, never one to resist a jab, leaned over and said with a smirk, "Still singing for your supper, Cliff?" How quaint. The room went quiet. Everyone knew it was more than a joke. It was a dismissal, a reminder that Burton saw Cliff as lightweight compared to serious actors like himself. But this time, Cliff didn't swallow the insult. Years of resentment boiled over, and he shot back, his voice cold and sharp. "Still drinking for yours, Richard?" The room froze. It was a dagger to the heart, dragging Burton's well-known alcoholism into the spotlight in front of colleagues and crew. For a moment, it looked like the two men might actually come to blows. Crew members later admitted they'd never seen Cliff so openly furious or Burton so stunned by a comeback. The producers, terrified of the scandal that would erupt if it aired, made the decision to cut the entire exchange from the broadcast. To the public, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but to those who were there, it was unforgettable. A clash of egos that could have blown up live on British television. Burton died the following year, in 1984, at only 58 years old. His death froze the feud in place, unresolved and unfinished. Cliff never spoke openly about it again. Whenever Burton's name came up in interviews, he'd give a polite smile and say something like, "Some things are better left in the past." But friends who know him well claim his jaw still tightens at the mere mention of Burton. Which of these clashes shocked you the most? Share with us in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and remember, the smoothest voice can still have the sharpest edges.